It's the week ending Friday the 26th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Joe Biden dropping out of the presidential race, Keir Starmer suspending the whip from 7 rebel MPs, and Snoop Dogg carrying the Olympic torch through Paris the day before the opening ceremony. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you 3 stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And Olly is away this week, probably, I imagine, in a semi-ironic Hawaiian shirt, sunning himself on a beach somewhere. So joining me today from the week's digital team, it's Rebecca Messina, writer and performer Suchandrika Chakrabarti, and podcast newbie, academic and podcaster Professor David Runciman. David, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Now, tradition dictates that as it's your first time on the show, you must declare to us all a fact about yourself we couldn't have discovered merely by Googling you.
So this one relates to something we're going to be talking about. I used to work in a betting shop back in the day when betting shops were called betting shops, and they were extremely smoky, and lots of old men gathered to listen to the horse racing on the radio. So that both tells you how old I am, but also tells you how I used to think it was a good idea to make a living. Not anymore.
Yeah, right. I'm updating your wiki page even as we speak. Anyway, David, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It should definitely be remembered for the fact that Kamala Harris is now the Democratic nominee, but I don't think we have any idea how it will be remembered.
Despite stepping away from active politics, Obama commands a sizable say in the Democratic Party. His support was instrumental in securing the presidency for Joe Biden back in 2020. And experts say that Obama's support will be vital for Harris going ahead if it comes through. Because it's not just Obama who has shunned endorsing Harris, several prominent Democrats have stayed away from backing the current vice president.
A report from First Post America from Tuesday this week. David, the underreported aspect of your story is less what has happened and more what didn't happen, or more specifically what wasn't said. What was that exactly?
Yeah, so that hinted that quite a few senior Democrats hadn't come out to endorse Kamala Harris, even though it was clear very early on she was going to be the nominee. No one was standing against her. Successively, they have. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer and others have. But the one who still is standing out as we record, though it's imminent, I think, is Barack Obama. And as usual, there are conspiracy theories about this. Lots of people are speculating it's because Obama wanted Michelle to be the nominee and so on. And as usual, the conspiracy theories are probably wrong. But it does highlight a real dilemma for the Democratic Party, which is this has been engineered behind the scenes by the power brokers in the party. But that's not a good look, because in American politics these days, people do not like politicians engineering outcomes. And they are in a quandary over this. And Obama's silence speaks volumes in that respect. I don't think it tells us anything about, I'm sure he supports Harris to the hilt, but he knows his support is both vital and also looks like it's a fix.
I mean, isn't this simply Obama's effort not to, as he says himself, thumb the scale? You know, people around him said that his intention by not speaking yet was to make it clear that he would, that this wasn't merely going to be a coronation for Kamala Harris. Isn't that important?
It's important, but it's also the problem for them because he did thumb the scale. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not telling you that all sorts of nefarious things happened behind the scenes. What happened behind the scenes was what we call politics, high politics. This is how it works, right? You have to be very naive to think that when a party realizes its candidate is not fit for office, there's not panic behind the scenes and all sorts of people doing all sorts of things that they don't want to be seen in public. And Obama has history here. He fixed it for Joe Biden to get the nomination in 2020. He's a power broker in the party. He's the most influential Democrat, but he can't be seen to be doing this in public. And so he does find it, I think, very difficult to know in this circumstance what to do. His support is crucial. He's very popular. He and his wife are still among the most popular public figures in America. But he is also a politico to his fingertips. And he has been, his fingerprints are all over this. I mean, all over it. His people were out there briefing against Biden. It's a real dilemma for the party. And it's a real dilemma going right the way up to November, which is it has been a coronation. They did fix it. Kamala Harris was not popular within the party even a few weeks ago. A lot of the people who are endorsing her now, saying that she's the saviour of the party, would not have said or thought or believed that a month ago. It's politics, but the party's pitch is we're better than the other side. So they're really stuck on this question.
And yet, even despite that unpopularity, Rebecca, there has been this record amount of donation that poured into Kamala Harris's campaign in the first 24 hours after Biden took that step back. There is a certain wind in Harris's sails. Can she maintain that? And is she a candidate that can, in the end, excite Democratic voters?
It depends, really. It's really easy to get drawn into what we see online. Obviously, for most of us, that's the most contact that we have with what American voters are thinking. And when you go on TikTok, you go on X these days, there are a lot of memes. Obviously, there's the coconut tree thing, the brat thing, that's everywhere. But it is increasingly clear, I think, that a lot of voters are no longer active on those platforms, particularly in the case of X. A lot of people did leave, and it's a very loud, vocal place now, but it doesn't necessarily represent what people are thinking. And also that a lot of that popularity is coming from younger voters who we do know traditionally aren't the ones that go out to vote. But the money does talk. It does show that there is a bit of excitement around Kamala. And also there's just a more united energy on the left. A few years ago, David sort of alluded to this, the conversation around Kamala Harris from progressives was really centered around her role in California's legal system, particularly, disproportionate imprisonment of black men, particularly on low-level marijuana offences. And that hasn't disappeared. And obviously, there's a really good argument to be said that candidates shouldn't be let off the hook. But on the whole, I do think it's interesting to see that the left-leaning kind of, media, political Twitterati sphere is in general seeming to coalesce and galvanise around its candidate, which, to be fair, has been one of the great strengths of the Republican Party. It's often said that they do know how to unite around a candidate and not sort of succumb to infighting. So it's interesting to see a bit of that energy on the left, which certainly wasn't really there while it was the Biden campaign.
And yet, I guess, if I'm reading you right, David, your contention was that voters will feel let down by Democrats if they're no better than the Republicans, who, after all, have gone with J.D. Vance for vice president, for Trump. Not so very long ago, Vance compared Trump to Hitler. But, do people actually expect more from their politicians these days, Suchandrika? Does it matter if they don't deliver, or they are at least just giving us a sort of politics as usual? Do people expect something other than that?
Does it matter if they don't deliver? What a massive question. I think with the speed of how news and politics are sped up, that very generally politicians get less time on the stage. I mean, just look at how many Conservative prime ministers we got through. It's almost Australian. Yeah, I think we're pretty used to politicians not delivering, and you can let a certain jadedness and certain cynicism creep in, but you don't want to be like that. Like, we're always looking for hope, and anything that Obama touches in American politics, we want it to still have that feeling of 2008. Like, I was working for American news agency, the AP, back then, and when in London, and so when we could see that he was going to get in, it was incredible. There were champagne corks popping, more like coffee, but it was an incredible thing, and people did have hope, and it did feel like a sea change in politics. And then we've had another one going the other way, unfortunately. But can politicians not deliver? Kamala Harris has form in being more kind of centre-left and being sort of linked to businesses. And that actually probably works for where the Democratic Party is right now, fighting against a very right-wing Republican Party. So a bit like what we've had in the UK, they don't want to look too far left because they don't want to lose that kind of centre ground. So in that sense, she's quite helpful. On the other hand, there's a piece from Sky News Australia today that Barack Obama was reportedly shocked that Joe Biden endorsed Kamala Harris as he sort of left politics. So who can say, I think when there's we saw this with the Kate Middleton disappearance rumours, when you leave a gap with important public figures, we all have social media now, and we all run in like amateur detectives and we go, let's fill that gap. Maybe not us here, because we know something about the rules around media and reporting, but your general public comes in and assigns a character to these very famous people and sort of says, well, maybe this stuff is happening. So what I've just quoted here is from a source close to the Biden family that's been talking to the New York Post. Who's that? That could be anyone. But I will say there's a feeling of authenticity to it. The feeling of, there is this infighting, there's been this king-making, and there's a bit of blowback. It does feel right, which is why I've brought it into this podcast today. So I think that we need politicians to get through a general cynicism that's set in the US and the UK and show us that maybe things can get better. I don't want to quote that song, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this story sort of reminds me, David, of the old Winston Churchill quote that you can always rely on Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted all other possibilities. Is Biden standing down and making way for Harris not ultimately the right move for the party and potentially for the country?
I think it's the right move for the party at the wrong time. I think there's now agreement. If he was going to do it, it would have been helpful if he could have done it sooner. And no question, part of the reason that he didn't do it sooner is there is bad blood between the Bidens and the Obamas. That, this isn't sort of Borgia-style politics, but there's some feeling that the Obamas have always slightly patronized. And by the Obamas, I mean the people around Barack Obama. I don't mean this is family to family, although the wives are important in this story. But the people around Obama have been briefing against Joe Biden, the sort of David Axelrods. And Biden has always felt throughout his career that certain people have patronized him, and that includes the Obama camp. He's also aware, I think, that he probably owes his presidency. He thinks Obama blocked him in 2016, but he also knows Obama has been the kingmaker in the party. This is all going on behind the scenes. We know it. I don't think we should be shocked by it. I don't think we should think that something terrible has happened. This is politics. The problem for the Democrats is they have pitched themselves so much as being not like the other side. There's J.D. Vance, there's Donald Trump. You can't trust what they say. These people are liars and manipulators. And the big problem for the Democratic Party is that the American public have seen over the last couple of months that, not that they're worse than the other lot, but they're not that different, actually. There's been quite a lot of manipulation, backstage stuff going on. I think their mistake has been to pitch themselves as the anti-Trump party as their central message, because actually the danger is voters think you're as bad as each other. And then you've got a problem if you're the Democrats. Donald Trump is a terrible candidate. He is a weak candidate. He always loses, right? He's only ever won once in 2016, and that was a kind of miracle. He should have lost that one. The Democrats somehow managed to lose that one. But he lost in 2018, he lost in 2020, he lost in 2022. They should be able to beat him in 2024, but you beat him by having just a better candidate up against him who focuses on the issues and highlights what's wrong with Trump's program for America. The Democrats have allowed themselves to be sucked into a story which is about who knew what, when, how, who lied, what did they lie about, who's really pulling the strings, why are people saying something about Kamala Harris that they didn't believe a month ago. They need to get back to reminding people that there's a choice on substantive questions. I think the real danger of what's happened in the transition from Biden to Harris is that it looks like high politics politicking, and that's not a losing position for the Republicans. If everyone's as bad as everyone else, Trump probably wins. If you judge it on the merits, Trump loses.
Yes. I mean, on the other hand, a big part of the Democrats' platform has seemed to be just, as you are saying, David, we need to stop Trump. That's kind of the start and end of it. But Rebecca, if that's their message, does it matter who the messenger is or how they got to be the candidate in the first place?
No, and I think probably worth emphasising, a lot of listeners probably aren't super interested in the ins and outs of US politics, that it isn't a legal issue. I mean, the few people have come out and said, there's this law in Ohio that means that it's too late to switch county, blah, blah, blah. But the general consensus used to be that there isn't going to be a legal challenge to Harris succeeding Biden. And that's purely because this isn't a presidential election. This isn't the fundamental American right to vote or democracy. This is the bureaucratic process of a private association, the Democratic Party. In 1981, the Supreme Court upheld that party rules couldn't be infringed on by state election laws, because essentially this is what it is. It's an internal selection process. And if you think about it, it's kind of like, in the presidential election, voters aren't technically voting for the candidate directly. They are voting to tell the delegates in the Electoral College which way they want them to vote. And it's kind of similar here. So, what Democrats are doing when they vote in the Democratic primaries is they are telling the state delegates of the Democratic Party how to vote at the National Convention. And in all cases, there are always, in the party rules, but also in individual state election laws, there are clauses that permit delegates to not vote the way that they pledged, which obviously would be Biden, if the candidate, dies or drops out, or usually there's also a clause that says if they in good conscience can't vote for that person, they are freed from their obligation. So it's one of those things where the idea that it's a fix or that it's shady has kind of a truthiness to it, partly because, as we've talked about, there is so much cynicism around politics, but really, it's really a bureaucratic issue more than anything else. It's not an impingement on democracy or freedoms. I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether that becomes an issue in the campaign, whether the Republicans do try and use that as ammunition, because I think it could go either way. It could be something that contributes to the perception that, Democrats are out of touch. They don't care about ordinary people and what they want. Or it could just be one of those things that ends up looking like really inside baseball mudslinging that average voters really don't care about. So it'd be interesting to see if it does come up.
Okay, well, we've got more truthiness on the way. Illicit casinos, and are we setting ourselves up for misery in retirement? That's after this. Okay, Rebecca, it's your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Well, here in Britain, gamblers are warned when the fun stops stop. Well, in the Philippines this week, the fun has very much stopped.
If you look at the cost-benefit analysis presented by the DOF, no less than the DOF, who's in charge of revenue, basically, they said that the country loses about 99 billion pesos a year because of the social cost created by POGOs. Because of POGOs, a lot of these criminalities are being reported out internationally, and that affects the image and the reputation of the country as an investment destination.
Philippine Senator Sherwin Gatchalian speaking to news channel ANC 24/7 on Wednesday about POGOs. Rebecca, what are POGOs and what's the story here?
Yeah, so POGO is an acronym for Philippine Offshore Gaming Operators. These are online gambling operations that are set up in the Philippines, but specifically to cater to gamblers in China, where gambling is banned everywhere except the Special Autonomous Region of Macau, and in fact banned to the extent that technically Chinese citizens are committing a crime if they gamble overseas. In his State of the Nation address on Monday, the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., nicknamed Bongbong, announced that they were going to be banned. This does have a significant impact in the Philippines, not least because there are about 40,000 Filipinos employed by the POGOS sector, as well as about 20,000 foreign nationals. Most of them are Chinese. The sector was massively diminished in the Philippines during the COVID pandemic. They once had 300 licensed operators. That's now down to 42. But even so, the sector does make a lot of money, roughly $2.8 billion, more than it costs. But as the senator was saying in the video, the reputational damage is thought to be harming the Philippines as an investment proposition. And also, as we'll get into, they have become linked to a vast, murky underworld connected with scamming, human trafficking, sex trafficking, even murder.
Okay, so perhaps we'll park that murky underworld aspect for just a moment. But the crackdown itself is a moment of kind of accord between China and the Philippines, two countries which have, it's fair to say, had a fairly tense relationship in recent years. What's behind that tension, Rebecca? And isn't their collaboration here potentially a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, the tensions between the two countries really relate to control of the South China Seas, and that's been an ongoing issue. Under Marcos's predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, he really had a quite pro-China outlook, and that kind of allowed POGOs to flourish, even though Beijing is against them, because most of them are run by Chinese entrepreneurs. So there was a sense that they were welcoming in Chinese money, and that could make things, sort of behind the scenes a little bit easier to deal with in Beijing. However, the Chinese government is now extremely concerned because a lot of the victims of the scams being perpetrated by POGOs, and we'll go into this, are Chinese nationals. These gambling websites were aimed at Chinese nationals, and now they are the ones being taken in by the crime side as well. So Beijing is no longer willing to turn a blind eye to them. So it is actually, although Marcos's policy is now sort of pursuing the opposite of what Duterte was doing, it's still actually in line with that broader pro-China agenda. And also it has the controversies around pogos have damaged relations with China in specific ways too. There was a raid on an unauthorized pogo operation that was found to be, it was being run on land that was partially owned by the mayor of the town, who is herself a Chinese Filipina national, but then she was accused of being a Chinese spy, which sounded like a conspiracy theory, except for the fact that not only did she own part of the land that this illegal operation was on, she also was unable to give details about where she grew up, why she'd never been registered in a Filipino school. There was quite a lot of evidence suggesting that she actually possibly was a Chinese spy. So incidents like that have added to friction between the two countries. So it probably is a positive sign of cooperation between them that they are cracking down on these operations.
Yeah, right. And David, why are they largely run by and catering to Chinese people?
Well, as Rebecca said, gambling is banned in China. It's sort of a bit like the age of prohibition or something in the United States. Two of the things that the world is awash with, gambling and pornography, are both banned in China. And as powerful and big a country as China is, this will have enormous spillover effects outside of China where people will try and cater for these things. And one of them is clearly gambling. Gambling is banned in China not primarily because of its ancillary effects, but because gambling itself is thought to be bad for the moral standing of Chinese citizens. But the focus of this story, what's so interesting about it is that this is not a clampdown because gambling is a bad thing per se. It's a clampdown because when something is banned in somewhere like China and you have these spillover offshore, essentially rogue operations, you will get organized crime around them, as you did with prohibition in the United States. So if you ban something for which there is a demand and which is being catered for in all sorts of other ways, we know it with the regulation of drugs, with illegal drugs, you get crime around it. So in a way, what's interesting about gambling is there are two ways you can think about this. In some places, and some people think gambling is a bad thing. It's bad for people. It's addictive. It's harmful. It's a destructive industry, which is probably the internal Chinese perspective. But then you have a story like this, which is when external actors cater for the people who still want to gamble, what you get around that is everything, as Rebecca said, that goes from embezzlement to murder. And those are worse things than gambling.
I mean, that's the curiosity in a funny way, isn't it, Suchandrika, that casinos themselves are generally pretty lucrative enterprises. Why have so many illicit casinos, not just in the Philippines, but across Southeast Asia? Why have they had to pivot to criminality when they should just be able to make their money by selling people the service that you'd expect on the tin?
So as Rebecca's mentioned, this is an issue across Southeast Asia. It seems like it's been helpful for China to kind of invest in these other countries. It's kind of given them power across Southeast Asia by having money in these pogos across the area. But we have seen places like Cambodia cracking down on gambling after the pandemic hit, and obviously people weren't going to the casinos. They then pivoted because they still needed to make money and became scam centres. And actually, like, you did find more scam calls and things like that happening across the world during COVID. So they all went remote as well, which is so strange. But like scam phone calls were definitely on the up because I guess they got to keep making money. And so these centres basically can't really operate fully on the level, and so they do get involved in things like that, and then they do get involved as places where victims of human trafficking and then employed, or quote unquote employed, and they become places where just all kinds of illicit activity, all the way to providing plastic surgery for gangsters and other people on the run, which is an incredible offshoot from the beginnings of just being a casino. But it's kind of a place where everything's happening in the back room under the counter, and they'll be tricky to separate as well. Like if a casino side shuts down, possibly the lack of money will change things, but there are much bigger problems that have kind of piggybacked onto the original casinos themselves, which were catering to a country where they weren't meant to be gambling. So it's like a snowball situation here.
And why, Rebecca, are pogos more of a concern to Ferdinand Marcos Jr. than they were to his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, who, after all, billed himself as massively tough on crime in every way?
Yeah, I think that was because before the pandemic, there were so many licensed operators who obviously were paying revenue, taxes, fees, etc., into the Treasury directly. Now, as I mentioned, they're down to 42. But in the meantime, there's now about 400 unlicensed operators. So the situation really is that the Philippines government does not stand to gain from this anymore. So it's easier to just shut the whole operation down. And this has been, as we've alluded to, it's an issue across Southeast Asia. And there's kind of an interesting reason to it, which is that multiple countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, they have laws that ban their own country's nationals from gambling within the country, but foreigners are allowed to. So all across the border cities of those countries, you have huge casino sectors, massive gambling operations, so that people can theoretically cross the border and gamble in a neighboring country. And Chinese entrepreneurs have invested really heavily in those border casino cities, etc. And so what you get now is cities like Sihanoukville in Cambodia, which is 95% Chinese owned. The 95% of the city's businesses are Chinese owned. And when Cambodia banned online gambling, that was in late 2019, the casinos have transformed into these vast scam centers. There are hundreds, if not thousands of people who are being held there basically as victims of human trafficking. But it's like an interesting thing because they are being used to perpetrate criminal activities. They're not necessarily, the most sympathetic victims of human trafficking that you could possibly find. Like those people who are calling you up, or sending you fake text messages, they could well be victims of human trafficking. Some really horrible stories as well that have emerged from people that have sort of been rescued from those situations. Abuse, having their passports taken away, being basically imprisoned in these giant ghost building casinos, and, physical violence, electrocutions, real torture level of stuff that's all in connection with this incredibly murky business, which really is a real epidemic. And I think hasn't really been talked about a lot, certainly in the West, but is definitely affecting, probably on the whole, tens of thousands of people, if not up to hundreds of thousands of people across Southeast Asia.
And one of the things we promise in this show is that it may offer stories that have repercussions for all our lives. And I can imagine listeners may be thinking that a story about illegal gambling operations in the Philippines may not directly affect them. But David, there is a link to the UK too. How do pogos connect to the Premier League?
Yeah, so this is a story about illegal or illicit gambling. But as I suggested, the other side of this is the extent to which legal gambling is so ubiquitous now. I mean, I feel like my betting shop days are a long way, as we talk about this story, a long way behind me. I worked in a shop where there had to be a beaded curtain across the door because it was thought that what went on in there was so shocking that people walking down the high street shouldn't be allowed to see it.
These beads will hold them out, protect their sensitivities.
The thought was to get a glimpse of old men with a roll-up betting 50p on a horse race was so scandalous that young people might be corrupted by it. So working in one of these felt like working in a sex shop. I'm not kidding.
Yeah,
it was
right.
You walked in the door and you felt you were going into a dark underworld, and that feels so tame and so analog compared to what we've just been hearing about from Rebecca. But, Britain is a country where gambling has been liberalised to an astonishing degree compared to 20 or 30 years ago. The story that stood out for me this week was 11 of the 20 Premier League clubs, soccer clubs, in England next season are going to be sponsored by gambling firms, many of them Asian-based, targeting the huge Asian audiences for Premier League football.
Yeah.
And there is something genuinely shocking to me about that. Gambling is one of the vices. It is a vice. I've done it. I'm a gambler. I gamble. I've worked in the gambling industry. It's a vice. When the fun stops. It's not fun. It's addictive. It's bad for people. It destroys lives. I don't think you can ban it because actually people will want to do it, but you should regulate it. I think you should take it pretty seriously. And there's a kind of license here. What's happening in the Philippines is a reaction against the Wild West illegal side of this. But what you get in Britain is the fact that we've just become accustomed to the thought that gambling is one of the industries that the government's not going to take much interest in, partly because it's a massive tax-raising industry. It's very easy just to levy tax on the gambling industry. So it'll be light touch regulation. And I don't think we talk about that enough, actually. It occasionally comes up in British politics that it should be better regulated. If you just imagine, if 11 of 20 Premier League clubs were being sponsored by crisp manufacturers, there would be outrage. So crisps are also a vice, but frankly, gambling is worse.
Yeah. I mean, that's another problem, isn't it, Suchandrika, that the more you regulate official gambling, then the more it drives people to the black market. So what should be done to solve the problem?
Again, another really massive question for me. Well, when I become the president of...
You step in where the politicians have failed.
Well, okay, I think it's worth looking at where casinos are helpful to the Filipino economy, and if they could then divert other revenue streams into taking their place, because maybe that's what the incentive would be for a government to crack down on all the issues around the casinos. So they might say, right, China wants us to stop with the pogos. That's a huge incentive. But what about all the other issues around it? So in terms of job losses, you can have job losses on the casino floor with dealers, security staff, hospitality and so on. And you've got indirect jobs, things like suppliers and maintenance. And I'm talking above board stuff here. So this would lead to huge job losses. What are they going to do about that? What are the alternatives? They need to think about, if we're not retraining or looking at some kind of allowance for these people, they'll be more attracted to crime, to working with gangs, to finding money in any other way. They need to survive. So how can we make sure the people working there aren't sort of sucked in? In terms of revenue loss, so the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation, PAGCOR, they report substantial revenues from casinos. It really does keep them afloat in many ways. And these contribute hugely to government funds they're used for social and infrastructure projects. So it's a bit like our libraries, if they were to ever come back, sort of being paid for by the proceeds of Betfair or something. But that's kind of how the black market and the underground stuff has got so entwined with actual government money in quite a dangerous way. This is going to take longer than one presidential term to untangle, and there'll be lots of people interested in not untangling this as well, so that's going to be really tricky. And then you have the tourism side. So I've not been to the Philippines, but from people who've gone, I've heard it's incredible, a very beautiful place. But then at night, what you have are these casinos as well. You've got them in the Philippines and obviously across the whole of Southeast Asia. So at night, that's where tourists love to go. It's where they might go instead of going to Las Vegas, because it's probably cheaper to get to Asia and your day-to-day costs are a bit cheaper. So they're going to lose these huge tourist attractions. What do they have in place of that? What are people going to be doing at night? Does it then mean having more bars, more alcohol? Is that going to be a problem? So something will always replace that, because people want to do something fun in the evenings. So I think they've got a very tricky problem on their hands. Extricating the good from the bad, and also replacing the fun that people find in gambling with something else.
And Rebecca, just briefly, do you think that this crackdown by Marcos Jr. is going to inspire other countries to follow suit? Are we going to see the UK doing more to regulate online gambling, for example?
Yeah, and I think actually, just to pick up off what Suchandrika was saying, I think in that clip up top with Senator Gatchalian, I think that's what he was alluding to when he was talking about reputational damage to the Philippines, especially in the post-Duterte era, when a lot of people during his presidency were sort of put off because the Philippines seemed like it was under sort of semi-dictatorial leadership. And I think now what they're looking for is that foreign investment from across the world. They didn't say China specifically, but obviously if this is something that Beijing are going to be happy with, then that's going to encourage legitimate foreign investment, which hopefully will make up for some of the losses in the gambling sector as well. In the UK, I was absolutely shocked to find out what a huge market there was for illicit gambling in the UK, because, as David was alluding to, we've so liberalised laws around gambling here that I thought, how could there possibly be that much demand for it? But apparently it made £270 million in revenue last year, and a huge part of that is because, there has been some lobbying, as we've talked about before, to bring in tighter regulations on gambling to make sure that people are, as much as possible, being protected from their own, impulses. But that has, in a way, not too dissimilar to what's happened in the Philippines, fed this illicit gambling market, because if you're gambling with these unlicensed operators, that means you're getting slightly better odds on one thing because they're not paying tax, so they can afford to offer slightly better odds. But also players can circumvent identity checks, betting limits, affordability checks have been brought in. So these are the most vulnerable people in a way who are also being lured into these unauthorized operations. And obviously, if they get scammed, they have no recourse, And on a global scale, I've read this thing, it was incredible. If illegal gambling was a country, it would have the third largest economy in the world. So there really is just limitless demand for it.
Remarkable. Okay, Suchandrika, you're up next after this. Okay, Suchandrika, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
If you're going to book that retirement cruise, you might want to change your plans.
Well, team, our new essentials for retirement, we have a list.
Yes, we do.
Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. I'm too close to the camera, but Dark Side of the Moon, one of my all-time favourite albums. We have it on vinyl, we have it on digital download as well. Just love it and love the money.
You look great on it, Norm.
Tina and Norm in the video Our Latest Treasures We Found in Retirement from their YouTube channel, This Is Our Retirement, posted on Friday. Happy retirees, Suchandrika. Is that now a thing of the past?
I think they're going to become a bit scarce. So the latest news we had this week is from a survey by Scottish Widows, and they found that 2 in 5 pension savers face a, quote, miserable retirement because rising living costs threaten to outstrip the sort of fixed income you have in old age, your pension. It's not like completely brand new news, but I think the statistics are worth looking at because they're quite scary. Some 38% of 16 to 64-year-olds, that pretty much, I'd say that covers us, we're forecast to fall short, and that's up from 35% in last year's survey. So that cost of living has really been biting, hasn't it?
Yeah, there are several different classes of retirement covered off in the Scottish Widows report. They have comfortable and moderate and dignified, etc. What does each class mean in practice? You know, at the bottom level, which is rising, are we talking about people not having enough food and insufficient heating in winter?
So there's meant to be something called the minimum standard, and that is defined as having enough income in retirement to cover your basic needs, with some left over for non-essential spending. And this is where we get into what is non-essential spending, and like if you live in a city, if you live in a rural area. And that includes being able to afford a 1-week UK holiday and having £50 to spend a week on groceries. What? Or £95 as a couple. Have they seen grocery bills? I mean, £50, people are not going to be well fed. We're talking about the most fragile people with ill health, people who can't necessarily advocate for themselves as well as they would have done if they were younger. So the minimum standard also assumes that someone would not have a car. Now, that's a bit tricky as well. On the one hand, it can be difficult when somebody is of advanced age in driving. But again, that is assuming that everyone's in a place like London, which they definitely are not, and they could get to the shops easily or get to the doctors easily. So that is a problem. And so the absolute bleakest outlook is for the cohort aged 22 to 29. I'm so sorry, Gen Z. It's always on you. 47% of them are on course to miss the minimum standard by the time they hit retirement age, whatever that age will be, because it's already going up to 68 for us. So what it will be for them, we don't know. So we're kind of looking at, we're in a turbulent time, and it's incredibly difficult to forecast from today what we're going to need when people today are 68, 70, 80, 90.
Yeah, David, is this a kind of failure of imagination on the part of people of all ages? You know, it's hard to imagine getting old in the same way that it's hard to imagine dying, which is probably at least part of why people don't attend to their pensions properly when they're young. Plus, the world is a volatile place. You know, is it getting harder to imagine what the future might look like?
Yes, it definitely is getting harder. And I also feel very sorry for Gen Z here. I mean, this is a Scottish Widows report, so the subtext is not hard to understand here. They think more people should be investing money with companies like them to prepare for a comfortable retirement. But the two implications of that is, one, somehow Gen Zers are leading these chaotic, irresponsible lives, and the pension industry is a responsible, well-regulated industry. I think most people have internalized that you're not completely confident of where you will be with your pension in a few years' time, because it's not been a particularly reliable industry. You know, I'm in the university sector, and trust me, pensions are not just a very divisive issue, but also you feel very, very insecure actually relative to just planning for the future because you don't know what a pension is going to be. But secondly, if you're 22 and you're being told to think about the world in 40 years' time and whether you'll have a car or not, I think if you're 22, you don't know whether there will be cars, and certainly whether you'll be driving them, because there'll be self-driving cars or they'll be, floating off the ground because you'll be wearing your jetpack or whatever it is. The world in 40 years' time is almost unimaginable. I don't think that's kind of young people being weird and sort of space agey about it. It's them being rational and serious about it. Will there be jobs? Will there be a universal basic income? Will there be pensions as we understand them? Will there be money as we understand it? Will we have moved to a completely different kind of political economy? So I feel like two very different questions here. If you're 65 and you're facing a precarious retirement. That is an issue for contemporary politicians to deal with, and that's a very serious question. For Scottish widows to be telling 22-year-olds to put their money in Scottish widows so that in 40 years' time they'll have a car strikes me as bullshit.
Yeah. Well, with our rational and sensible hats on then, Rebecca, the Labour Party is currently conducting a wide-ranging pensions review. Should it include commitments to raising the minimum contribution levels for workplace pension schemes? I mean, should it be the government compelling people to put more money away? Is that going to be part of the solution?
One thing that's interesting is that at the moment, like the minimum auto-enrollment contributions in private workplaces are 3% for the employees and 5% for the employers. But most of the schemes have been put forward, usually by industry bodies. When they talk about raising them, they almost always talk about raising the burden on the employee more. I've seen 6% and 6% being suggested as new contribution levels. And I do think the problem is that if people don't have the money, then the money can't come from somewhere magically. This is what it boils down to. And people say, if you look at the Scottish Widows report and they highlight people in their 20s as being the ones least prepared. Well, I don't know if that's as alarming as it sounds, because most people don't take their pensions seriously in their 20s, when most of us didn't earn enough to meaningfully raise our contributions. And I think we can assume that at least a good portion of people in that cohort will increase their contributions as they progress in their career. So one side of it definitely is the fact that people don't have the money or feel like they don't have the money. So compulsion from the government isn't really going to assuage those insecurities. And then the other thing is just the uncertainty. David's already talked about this a little bit. Logically, there is at least one good reason to feel uncertain, even if you don't believe that, society is going to change radically in the next 40 or 50 years. And that's inflation. The targets that we're told to aim for in our pension pots aren't arbitrary in the sense that they are obviously being drawn up by experts. But also, we don't really know what £22,000 a year will buy you in 2050. We don't know what inflation will look like. And a lot of the calculus that has been used to come up with what is a basic standard of living for pensioners has been predicated historically on the idea that the vast majority of pensioners will have a property as capital, and that's being called into question. Currently among those aged 45 to 64, 68% of them own their own home, and that's 13% less than the amount who did 20 years ago, and it's set to keep going down. So we don't really know what that's going to look like in the future. In a future world where most pensioners are renting their homes, what does an affordable retirement look like, and how do we come up with those calculations, 40, 50, 60 years in advance? It's just impossible. And I think that contributes to a general atmosphere of And I do think there's also a bit of a lingering ghost of the idea of cradle to grave welfare in our culture that makes people think, well, even if push came to shove, the government would have to make sure I didn't starve. And I don't know that we can't quite be sure that that's true.
If this report is right, at least, that a lot of people are going to end up with not a lot of money when they retire, Suchandrika, what are some of the ways that they can get by on the state pension alone when it's their only income?
Oh, well, okay, so I don't love these ideas because I don't think it takes into account the true reality of how little people have. But let's stay positive. What can people do? They can split costs with friends. Old age, famously a time when you have a lot of friends. Make the most of supermarket offers. Can they get to the supermarket? Are they one of the lucky ones with the car? Don't know. Reduce the cost of your food shop. How? Get cheap or free outings. Okay, well that depends on different offers, but it does need the concentration and knowing how to use the internet and trying to find all these offers. But fine, that is nice. Haggle for your home costs. So when all our utility bills went wild, the amount of phoning you have to do, the amount of obstacles they put in your way before you can speak to a person at whichever electricity or whatever place. The older you are, the more alone you are, the more ill health you're in. How much harder is that to do? So that's lovely advice, but I don't think it reaches the size at all of we're going to have a huge problem in the future if we don't rethink what retirement is, how it looks, and we're going to have some level of universal basic something, because otherwise we are going to be taking away dignity from people at that age, and we are going to see people starve, and hopefully we won't stand for that as a society. I really hope we don't.
Yeah. Well, retirement ages are drifting up anyway. To return to your story a step or two back, David, the US president is 81. Trump is 78, both well over the UK's state pension age of 66. And many people might like the idea of working later into their lives. I'm sure that doesn't account for everybody, but is working longer going to be part of the story going forward?
Yeah, I think both working longer and retiring earlier, what we know is that people's lives are not following a set pattern. It is not birth, school, work, retirement, death anymore. There's still birth and death, and in Silicon Valley they think even the last of those is up for negotiation. But in between, I know people, I'm sure you know people who are talking about retirement in their 40s if they're lucky, or if they've just decided there's a creative way to live that doesn't involve working for a living. And at the same time, I know people who are happily working into their 70s and into their 80s. We are in a more flexible world. There are more opportunities, but there are also obviously more risks in that world. It does put more of a premium on people deciding for themselves how they want to manage this. And I agree in a way. I think that behind it, there's a lingering sense that the state will take care of us. And that probably is a bit of a gamble because there's not so much money left and there's an enormous overhang of debt. We know that, both public and private debt, which makes the pension industry quite precarious. I mean, that's the other thing. The pension industry could blow up. And if that happens, all bets are off. There is more opportunity for people to make a living into old age. It would be a terrible world in which you are told, in order to have a dignified old age, you have to make a living. We have to start from the premise that though there are choices for people to make, and people will make different kinds of choices, when it becomes compulsory to make a certain kind of choice, then dignity does go out the window. I don't want to be 80 and be told I have to work. I would like to be 80 and told I have an option to work, just as I'm 57, I'd quite like to stop working now as well. So flexibility is good. Precarious flexibility is not good.
Well, we're going to have to retire this discussion here. My thanks to Rebecca, Suchandrika and David. And you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped, wherever you get your podcasts, and tapping follow. And you can get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Olly Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.